Hello, welcome to the Meachum Village YouTube channel. So let's talk about how you can use scripture to guide your marriage. First of all, if you and your spouse are followers of Christ, that means scripture is final authority. That's the only way your marriage is going to be successful and peaceful, and you guys are going to be unified and aligned, is if you both accept that scripture is final authority. It wins over feelings, it wins over parents' opinions, friends' opinions, even pastors' opinions. If you're getting feedback from people that conflicts with scripture, scripture wins. This is the primary way that our marriages are going to be healed and our families are going to be healed. This is the primary way that husbands and wives can walk together in unity. I remember when I was pregnant with my daughter. She's 7 years old now, but I had a high-risk pregnancy. And the physician, in so many words, alluded to having an abortion because she wasn't growing properly. Well, at least that's what he thought. Now, if my husband and I were not aligned on scripture being final authority, number one, we could have made a tragic decision. We also could have been at odds with each other. That could have caused a lot of back and forth with each other if we weren't already clear on what scripture says about this. But because we consider scripture final authority, we didn't have a whole lot of back and forth. In fact, we were aligned before we even discussed it. And it was a quick conversation. And one of the strengths, I would say, of our marriage is that we can make major life-changing decisions with very little discussion because we consider scripture final authority and we already know what that authority says on a lot of the major issues that'll come up. So let's talk about how we can actually use scripture. Here's a framework that I would recommend. Look for these 5 things: prescriptions, principles, precedents, patterns, and prophecies. I love alliteration. So prescriptions, principles, precedents, patterns, and prophecies. The good thing about scripture is that it comments on itself. So if you are unclear about something, if you're trying to understand a certain passage, there's usually another passage or 2 or 3 in the Bible that can give you more confirmation or give you more clarity. So let's look at prescriptions first. So think of the law that Yahweh dictated to Moses. Think of Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount. Prescriptions are those very clear, do this, not that instructions. I mean, very little gray. It's sad, but some people will still try to come up with, interpretations that conflict with this very clear guidance. But typically it's because they're making something up or they're trying to justify something that they want to do. For example, we're clear on when Christians can get a divorce. The Bible is clear on how we should be raising our children. It's clear on how we should regard long-term debt. Very clear, do this, not that instructions on topics like that. But sometimes folks want to come up with something else, but we consider scripture final authority. So that's prescriptions. The next one are the principles. So the Bible is full of profiles of individuals and families and events. And there are take-home messages within the lives of these individuals and these families and in the backdrop of these events. These take-home messages are still relevant today. One example that I always say is King David. When my husband and I were dating, I told him that he is going to need to read King David before we can consider marriage. I think King David his story has so many take-home messages on being a father, being a husband, being a leader, being a man who is gifted by God in so many ways. His message is just his life is just a walking take-home message for men that I think is so relevant today. The next one is precedent. So precedent is just like a court case. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that when they want to figure out what to do, they look at a prior case and kind of use that as an example of how they will rule in the current case. We can use scripture the same way. We can take a look at prior examples, prior events, prior situations, and determine, based on that example, where we stand today. I think Genesis is a great example of this. In the first, 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis, Yahweh is setting up humanity. And when he creates marriage, he creates it with several precedents that he expects to be followed. His precedent about leaving your parents when Adam and Eve didn't even have parents, leaving your parents to cleave to your spouse. He set up this precedent that the wife is the helper to the husband. These are precedents that he expects us to follow. We look at that as our prior example to guide us today. Let's talk about patterns. Patterns are probably my favorite element of scripture to look for. These are Yahweh's consistent action or reaction with reward or punishment. When he consistently rewards something, consistently punishes something, that gives us an indication of how he feels about it. This is so important because you'll have people say, well, Jesus never actually talks about this, or Jesus never says that this was wrong. Well, Jesus directly talking about something is not the only way we understand his expectations. You'll hear this a lot from what we call back of the book Christians, who don't look at the Old Testament stories for guidance. They only look at the sliver of scripture that focuses on Jesus's ministry, but the Old Testament testifies about him too. So we have to look at the full scope of counsel, and you'll see patterns in how Yahweh reacts, how Yahweh responds, how Yahweh gives guidance, how he instructs, to see what he loves and what he doesn't like. For example, it's not a coincidence that every time a woman is raped in the Old Testament, the follow-up is a military retaliation. Now, we don't have Jesus saying don't rape, but based on that pattern, we can tell he doesn't like it. There's also a pattern in scripture that when men who are called to assignment by God bend to the will of their wives, who is off track in some way, that never goes well. Not only does it ruin the marriage, it ruins several generations of their family. So these are patterns that we have to look closely for to understand what Yahweh's will is. And then we'll talk about prophecies. Look for what the prophecies say. So the prophecies are literally our bulleted list of what we need to be preparing for. It's telling us what we should be equipping ourselves and our children and our families for as our culture gets more and more antichrist. And these preparations are not things we can be doing in isolation. We have to do them in unity with one another. It's going to be really hard to prepare for tribulations, and it's going to be really hard to prepare for the hostility coming for Christ followers when you and your spouse are into it. Could you imagine if Noah and his wife weren't talking that day he got the message to build the ark? Like, we don't have time for lingering conflict. We don't have time for unforgiveness. We don't have time for unresolved issues in marriage, because that distracts us from who the real enemy is. It distracts us from what we should be preparing for and what we should be equipping our children for. So prophecy is another element to look for, to guide overarching sort of how you should be moving about in your marriage. I hope this was a helpful framework. As a sort of next step, I would say, when you and your spouse are looking for biblical guidance, lovingly challenge each other to come up with 3 to 5 passages that speak to this issue before you make your decision. We consult our feelings too much. Look for 3 to 5 passages of scripture that speak to whatever issue you guys are discussing or in contention about. If it's a money issue, it's definitely in scripture. If it's a sex issue, that's definitely in scripture. If it's an issue about parents, that's in there too. Most of the issues that are ripping Christ-following couples apart are covered in scripture. We have to be students of the word and be looking for it. So challenge each other. Come up with 3 to 5 passages of scripture that speak to the issue, and then make your decision about how to move forward. Do the same thing for your marriage counselor and your pastor and anybody else giving you advice. If they tell you something, if they recommend something, ask them, can they come up with 3 to 5 passages of scripture that back up what they're saying? Can they come up with several passages of scripture that confirm or point to the recommendations they're giving? And if they are not giving recommendations based on confirmation in scripture, It's time to find counsel that considers scripture final authority just like we should. I hope this was helpful. Please leave in the comments if you have any other thoughts about how we can use scripture to guide our marriages, fix our marriages, and heal our marriages. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you so much, and we will see you on the next one.